They say Rome wasn't built in a day, but if you'd stood on the edge of a Roman siege camp, you might have believed they were trying. Picture it, not the chaos of clashing swords, not the trumpet of cavalry charges, but the rhythmic thud of hammers and the grinding of wheels dragging massive machines into place. This was a different kind of battlefield, quieter, more deliberate, but no less deadly. See, when most people think about the power of Rome, they picture open field battles, the disciplined legions, the gleam of armor in the sun. But there was another side to Roman warfare, one that didn't just defeat enemies, but dismantled their cities, their confidence, their very sense of security. The Romans weren't just warriors. They were builders. And what they built, walls, towers, ramps, weapons, became just as crucial to their conquests as any spear or sword. Siege warfare was never glamorous, never swift. It was a grinding, psychological war of patience and precision. And Rome mastered it, not because they set out to reinvent it, but because they were stubborn enough to learn from every mistake and practical enough to steal every idea that worked. In fact, in the early days, they were far from masters. Their attempts were crude, ladders, brute force, chaotic charges, but they watched others, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Macedonians. They paid attention. And slowly, the Romans began to turn engineering into a weapon. They realized that victory didn't always come from meeting the enemy in the field. Sometimes, it came from outlasting them behind stone walls, wearing them down with machines, silence, and time. That's when their sieges became more than military operations, they became lessons in control. Not just of the battlefield, but of terrain, of psychology, of will. Because when a city saw a Roman siege line forming outside its walls, it wasn't just facing a threat. It was staring down the weight of an empire that knew how to wait, how to build, and how to break through anything that stood in its way. If you were a defender perched on the walls of your city, watching the Roman legions set up camp, your worst fear might not be the soldiers themselves, but what they dragged behind them. Massive machines made of timber and rope, strange contraptions you'd never seen before, were being assembled like puzzles in the dust. And then came the sound, the heavy creak of twisted cords, the sharp snap of tension releasing, followed by a terrifying silence broken only by the crash of a boulder slamming into the wall beside you. That was Roman artillery. But it wasn't meant to crumble your walls, it was meant to crumble your nerves. These weren't just weapons, they were psychological tools. Giant crossbow-like ballistae that hurled bolts so fast and heavy they could skewer a man through his armor and pin him to the tree behind. Onagers that launched stones with a vicious kick, making even the soldiers operating them step back in awe. But what made these machines so devastating wasn't just their power, it was the discipline behind them. See, unlike their enemies, the Romans didn't rely on specialized siege crews. They trained their regular troops to use these engines, turning ordinary legionaries into part-time engineers. Some learned faster than others, sure, but the Roman way wasn't about genius. It was about consistency. About making sure that when the order came to fire, every man knew what to do. And while these machines rarely broke through the toughest walls, that wasn't really the goal. Their job was to keep defenders ducking, to stop them from aiming, to create those small, critical windows where Roman troops could move forward, dig, climb, or build. In a way, these devices weren't about destruction, they were about distraction. A stone flying overhead might not kill anyone, but it could stop a soldier from throwing his own. And over time, that imbalance added up. The real genius of Roman artillery wasn't that it changed the battlefield, it shaped the rhythm of the siege. It gave the Romans time to work, to build, to wait. And that's the thing about siege warfare, every second you buy for your engineers is a step closer to victory. Rome understood that. And they turned those seconds into an empire. Sometimes in war, the obstacle isn't just the wall in front of you, it's the people behind it, determined to hold their ground no matter what you throw at them. And that's where Rome's siegecraft showed its true character. When brute force couldn't win the day, they got creative. Let's say artillery wasn't enough, and the walls held firm. That's when the real work began. Roman soldiers would move in close, often under the cover of those iconic overlapping shields, the testudo formation, like a living tank of iron and discipline. Under that shell of shields, they'd inch toward the walls with pickaxes and crowbars in hand, chipping away at the very bones of the city. And if that didn't break through, they'd dig. Sappers would tunnel beneath the enemy fortifications, propping up the earth with wooden supports. When everything was in place, they'd set the tunnel on fire, watching the flames eat through the beams until the wall above collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. It was a dangerous job, one miscalculation, and the tunnel might bury you instead of the enemy, but it was often worth the risk. Other times, the answer was above, not below. Scaling ladders came out, and Roman troops swarmed the walls like ants, pushing upward under a hail of arrows and stones. It was brutal, messy, and often chaotic. One wrong step, one broken ladder, and a soldier would plunge to his death. But if just a handful made it over, if they could hold their ground for even a few minutes, the rest would follow. The defenders knew this, which is why they fought so hard to shove the attackers back down. The pressure was enormous. Still, there was a smarter way, one that required more patience, more planning, and a lot more wood. Siege towers. These massive wooden structures weren't just about height, they were about safety. Soldiers could climb inside, protected by walls, until they reached the enemy ramparts. Then a drawbridge would lower, and suddenly the Romans were inside, pouring onto the walls in waves. Early on, the Romans weren't very good at this. There's a story of a siege tower tipping over during one of their first serious attempts. It's almost comical, if it weren't so costly. But Rome learned. Always. They figured out how to stabilize, how to build better, how to move faster. Eventually, their towers became symbols, not just of power, but of precision. And behind every tower, every tunnel, every battering ram, was one simple Roman truth: if there's no way through, make one. There's something almost surreal about watching an army reshape the land itself, not just to survive on it, but to conquer through it. When the Romans encountered terrain that didn't suit their siege plans, they didn't complain, they didn't retreat, they changed the terrain. Hills were leveled, valleys were filled, and mountains of earth were moved by hand, shovel by shovel, to build what they called the agger, a massive siege ramp that could carry entire towers forward like a bridge into the sky. It wasn't quick, and it definitely wasn't easy. Imagine thousands of men hauling dirt, timber, stone, all while under enemy fire, exposed to arrows and boiling oil from the walls above. But the Romans didn't let that stop them. They created protective corridors, movable shelters called vinii, like wooden tunnels draped in fireproof material, so their workers could move freely and safely as the ramp inched closer. For the front lines, they used enormous curved shields called pludii to guard the crews as they dug, hammered, and advanced inch by inch. It was all about control, controlling the space, the pressure, the timing. They knew that if they could build high enough, if the ramp could reach the wall, everything else would follow. At Avaricum, for example, Julius Caesar ordered a ramp so wide and tall it could fit 2 siege towers side by side, 80 feet high, over 300 feet across, a moving platform of war that seemed more like a city than a structure. And when it was complete, it wasn't just a path to victory, it was a message carved into the earth itself: Rome will reach you, no matter what stands in the way. These weren't just feats of engineering, they were declarations of intent. Because to the Romans, a siege wasn't simply a matter of strength. It was a slow, deliberate process of breaking the enemy's will, one rock, one trench, one beam at a time. And when they moved the land, they weren't just building ramps, they were building inevitability. But for all the brilliance and precision of Roman siegecraft, there was always a darker truth waiting at the end of it, a truth not written in stone or strategy, but in blood. Because once the walls finally fell, after weeks or months of grinding labor and relentless pressure, what came next wasn't always clean or controlled. The soldiers who had built those ramps and manned those towers weren't just engineers, they were human beings, exhausted, hardened, grieving for the comrades they'd buried along the way. And when the gates opened, when victory was finally within reach, something raw and emotional often took over. Cities were sacked. Fires were set. Loot was taken. Thousands could die in a matter of hours, not because of orders, but because the dam had broken. Sometimes, commanders tried to restrain their men. Sometimes they looked the other way. But in that moment, the rage of the siege spilled into the streets like a flood no one could stop. And yet, here's the strange thing, if a city surrendered early, if it opened its gates before the fighting began, the outcome could be completely different. Rome could be merciful, even generous. The contrast was sharp. Fight, and risk destruction. Yield, and you might be spared. That choice was always on the table. And that, in many ways, was the final stroke of Roman siegecraft, not a machine or a weapon, but a psychological edge sharpened by reputation. Because word traveled. Cities knew what had happened to others that resisted, and sometimes fear alone did what fire and stone could not. In the end, what made Roman siege warfare so powerful wasn't just the tools or the tactics, it was the totality of it. The coordination, the patience, the planning, the relentless momentum that turned even the most fortified cities into temporary obstacles. And behind all the structure and strategy was something even more enduring, a message etched into every siege ramp, every scorched gate, every breached wall: Rome will outlast you, outthink you, and if necessary, overwhelm you. Not just with force, but with purpose. And that's how they didn't just win battles, they built an empire. The story of Roman siege warfare isn't just one of machines and destruction, it's about discipline, adaptability, and the fusion of brain and brawn. The next time someone tells you Rome conquered the world with legions alone, ask them this: who built the ramps, who aimed the ballista, who turned hills into highways of conquest? Because in the end, the Roman soldier wasn't just a warrior. He was an architect of empire.